William is furious, and this time, insiders whisper it's not just anger, it's a cold, calculated unraveling of everything Prince Harry thought he could still control. Because the moment he reached for Princess Diana's legacy as a weapon, something snapped behind palace walls, and now the consequences are moving in silence. It didn't start loudly. No dramatic announcement, no royal statement, just a shift, subtle, surgical, the kind that only those watching closely could feel. Because while the world was distracted by California sunshine, curated smiles, and staged appearances, a very different story was unfolding beneath the surface. A story about inheritance, not just money, not just titles, but power, memory, and the dangerous line between honoring a legacy and exploiting it. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because according to the whispers circling both Hollywood and London, Prince Harry didn't just lean on his mother's legacy, he built a narrative around it. A narrative that some insiders claim began to blur into something else entirely. Something sharper, something more strategic, almost weaponized. At first, it looked like emotion, grief, a son protecting his mother's story. But then the patterns began to emerge. The repeated references, the careful timing, the alignment with projects, interviews, deals, and suddenly, what once felt personal started to feel performative, calculated. Like every mention of Princess Diana wasn't just remembrance, it was leverage. And that's when Prince William reportedly stopped seeing it as grief and started seeing it as a threat. Because for William, Diana isn't just memory, she's legacy, sacred ground, untouchable. And insiders said the moment Harry crossed that invisible line, turning her story into something that could be used, shaped, even sold, the reaction behind palace doors wasn't emotional. It was strategic, cold, precise, final. But here's where it gets even more explosive. Because while Harry was allegedly leaning into Diana's legacy, something else was happening in parallel. Something far more damaging. A legal storm, quiet at first, but growing. And at the center of it, a charity, a name, a connection that goes all the way back to Diana herself. Centabale, a foundation built in her honor, a symbol of compassion, of service, of everything she stood for. And now, it's at the center of a lawsuit involving her own son. Yes, that's where the whispers turn into shock. Because reports suggest that when the charity refused to align with certain narrative directions, refused to allow its work, its data, its stories to be used in a way that blurred ethical lines, things escalated fast. Allegations, accusations, legal filings. A situation that, according to those close to the matter, spiraled into something no one expected. And suddenly, the story shifted. This wasn't about Hollywood anymore. This wasn't about media deals or public image. This was about Diana and whether her legacy was being protected or used. The backlash? Immediate, intense, and deeply emotional. Because for the public, this wasn't just another royal controversy. This was different. This hit a nerve. The idea that Diana's name, her work, her compassion could be dragged into a legal battlefield, it felt like a line had been crossed. And inside the palace, silence. But not the kind of silence that means nothing is happening. The kind that means everything is. Because according to sources, Prince William didn't respond with words. He responded with action, quiet moves, strategic distancing, a tightening of boundaries that had already been forming, but now, insiders say, have become absolute. No more gray area, no more half in, half out, just a clear, unmistakable shift, separation. And while this was unfolding in the background, the public saw something else entirely. Appearances, events, carefully curated moments designed to suggest everything was still intact. Still connected, still relevant, but the cracks were there. In the photos, in the absence of certain people, in the subtle shifts of body language, positioning, proximity. Because in Hollywood, who stands next to you matters. And increasingly, insiders notice something strange. The distance, the lack of organic interaction, the absence of genuine connection. As if the room itself was quietly stepping back. And then came the numbers. Cold, unforgiving, impossible to spin. Projects that were supposed to redefine their image. Underperforming, rankings dropping, engagement fading, the kind of data that doesn't lie and doesn't care about narrative. Because in the end, the industry doesn't run on headlines, it runs on results. And the results? They told a story no PR team could fully rewrite. A story of decline, of disconnect, of a brand that once thrived on mystery and proximity to power, now struggling to convert attention into relevance. And that's where the tension tightens. Because while one side is doubling down, pushing harder, speaking louder, trying to reclaim control of the narrative, the other side isn't reacting at all. No public rebuttals, no dramatic confrontations, just distance, strategic, measured, permanent. And that's what makes this moment feel different, because this isn't a fight anymore. It's a separation, a quiet, irreversible shift where one chapter is closing, not with a bang, but with a silence that says more than words ever could. But the real question, the one no one is answering publicly, is this. If Diana's legacy is now at the center of this storm, who truly controls the story moving forward? Because if what we're seeing is only the surface, then what's still hidden might be far more explosive. And here's where the story stops being just a slow unraveling and starts feeling like a full-scale exposure. Because the deeper you look, the more the patterns begin to align in a way that is almost impossible to ignore. What looked like scattered incidents, an awkward appearance here, a legal filing there, a subtle royal silence, suddenly begins to form a single, continuous narrative. A narrative where every move feels reactive, every decision feels pressured, and every public moment carries the faint scent of something slipping out of control. Because while Prince Harry continues to push forward with this image of independence, of breaking free, of rewriting his own story, insiders suggest that the reality behind the scenes is far more complicated, far more fragile, and far more dependent on something he can't fully escape, the very royal framework he claims to have left behind. It's in the contradictions that the truth starts to flicker. On one hand, there's the insistence on being separate, autonomous, detached from the institution. On the other hand, there's the continued reliance on titles, on associations, on that unmistakable royal aura that opens doors others can't even knock on. And that contradiction, it's not going unnoticed anymore. Not by the public, not by industry insiders, and certainly not by Prince William, who, according to those close to the situation, has reached a point where the ambiguity is no longer tolerable. Because from William's perspective, this isn't just about personal differences. It's about the integrity of something much bigger. And when that integrity is perceived to be under threat, especially through the use of a legacy as powerful and emotionally charged as Princess Diana's, the response is no longer optional. It becomes inevitable. What makes this even more unsettling is how the public perception has shifted. There was a time when every headline, every appearance, every statement generated sympathy, curiosity, even support. But now, the tone has changed. The same actions that once drew understanding are now being dissected with skepticism. Every gesture is questioned. Every claim is scrutinized. And perhaps most dangerously, every attempt to control the narrative is being met with a growing resistance from an audience that feels fatigued. Because there's only so long a story can rely on emotional intensity before people start asking for substance. And when the substance doesn't match the scale of the claims, the entire structure begins to wobble. And this is where the Hollywood dimension adds another layer of tension. Because unlike the royal world, where tradition can sometimes cushion impact, the entertainment industry is brutally transactional. It doesn't reward intention. It rewards performance, measurable, undeniable performance. And the data emerging from recent projects paints a picture that is difficult to ignore. Rankings slipping, engagement numbers failing to meet expectations, projects quietly reclassified, reshaped, or sidelined. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, but it's happening. And in Hollywood, quiet decisions often carry the loudest consequences. The absence of future commitments, the subtle distancing by major players, the lack of organic collaborations, all of it points to a shift that no amount of public visibility can fully counteract. And yet, despite these signals, the outward projection remains unchanged. Appearances continue, events are attended, narratives are reinforced. It's as if the strategy is to outpace the perception, to stay constantly in motion so that no single moment has time to settle and define the trajectory. But here's the problem with that approach. It works only as long as the audience is willing to follow. And increasingly, there are signs that the audience is stepping back, observing rather than engaging, questioning rather than accepting. Because when every moment feels curated, every interaction feels staged, and every message feels calculated, authenticity, the one thing that can't be manufactured, becomes the missing piece. Meanwhile, back in the UK, the response remains almost eerily consistent: silence. But not passive silence, active silence, the kind that communicates boundaries without needing to articulate them. Because every non-response, every absence of acknowledgement, every refusal to engage publicly is in itself a message that the institution is moving forward on its own terms, at its own pace, with its own priorities, and that those priorities no longer include accommodating the unpredictable cycles of external narratives. It's a form of control that doesn't rely on confrontation. It relies on continuity. And in that continuity, there's a quiet but unmistakable assertion of authority. What makes this dynamic so intense is that both sides are operating in completely different realities. On one side, there's a constant push for visibility, relevance, and narrative control. On the other, there's a deliberate withdrawal, a tightening of structure, and a focus on long-term stability. These aren't just different strategies, they're fundamentally incompatible approaches. And when they collide, the result isn't resolution, it's divergence, a widening gap that becomes harder and harder to bridge with each passing moment. And then there's the emotional core of all of this, the part that rarely gets addressed directly but is always present beneath the surface. Because beyond the strategies, beyond the public images, beyond the legal and financial complexities, there's a story about family, about memory, about identity. And when those elements become entangled with power, legacy, and public perception, the outcome is rarely simple. It becomes layered, conflicted, and deeply human in a way that no headline can fully capture. The use of Princess Diana's legacy in this context doesn't just raise questions about strategy, it raises questions about intention, about boundaries, about what is sacred and what is shareable. And that's why this moment feels like a turning point, not because of any single event, but because of the accumulation of them. The legal tensions, the industry signals, the shifting public sentiment, the institutional response, all of it converging into a single undeniable reality. The story is changing, and not in small, subtle ways, but in fundamental structural ones. The roles are being redefined, the expectations are being reset, and the space that once allowed for ambiguity is closing. But here's the part that lingers, the part that keeps this story from feeling finished. Because despite everything, despite the distancing, the silence, the shifting perceptions, the narrative is still unfolding. There are still moves being made behind the scenes, still decisions being taken that haven't yet reached the public eye, still tensions that haven't fully surfaced. And in that uncertainty lies the real question, the one that refuses to settle. If the legacy of Princess Diana has become the center of this conflict, and if the institution has already begun to draw its lines, then what happens next when those lines are tested again? Because history has shown that in moments like these, the most significant developments don't arrive with warning. They appear suddenly, shifting the entire narrative in an instant. And if the current trajectory continues, if the pressures keep building, if the divide keeps widening, then the next chapter of this story may not just redefine relationships, it may redefine the very way the public understands legacy, loyalty, and the cost of trying to control a story that was never meant to belong to one person alone.